At midnight, a widow whispers a secret no one should hear. Welcome to Crimson Whisper. I am your host, Bramwell. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I value every reply. Now, let's unlock the mystery. It was a night like any other in London, the fog rolling in from the Thames, smothering the streets with an oppressive damp haze. The gas lamps cast their feeble golden light through the mist, illuminating the dim shadows of the cobblestone alleys. But at midnight, one particular corner of the city, that of a modest yet grand townhouse on Elmhurst Street, was disturbed by an event that would soon draw the attention of the greatest detective in the world. A scream pierced the quiet of the night. A woman, once an elegant widow known for her charity work and refined manner, was found lying at the foot of the staircase, her neck twisted unnaturally, her eyes staring vacantly into the cold grey night. In an instant, the scene was secured. Scotland Yard had arrived and declared the death an unfortunate accident, but there were things that didn't sit right with Inspector Lestrade, and as he paced, wringing his hands, he knew he needed Holmes. "I'll send for him at once," he muttered. "This doesn't look right." The next morning, Holmes was found at his usual spot, lounging in his armchair, a violin resting idly beside him, his eyes half-lidded in concentration. He appeared unruffled by the insistent knocks that echoed through the flat. "Holmes?" Watson called, exasperated as he entered the room. "Lestrade insists you come at once. A widow, it seems, has died under mysterious circumstances." "Ah," Holmes murmured, barely shifting his position. "The widow Grayson, I presume. Do tell me, Watson, what do we know about her life?" "Her habits, her recent acquaintances." Watson raised an eyebrow. "You're already familiar with the case?" "Of course," Holmes replied, his eyes flickering with amusement. "The death of a prominent widow, found at midnight at the foot of her staircase." A scream that cuts through the fog. "It's a crime of the highest caliber, Watson. The question is, who benefits?" By the time they arrived at the townhouse, Lestrade was already there, impatiently waiting. He led them inside, gesturing to the scene. The body of Mrs. Grayson lay as it had been found. A tragic sight, yes, but Holmes's eyes quickly swept over the details. He walked around the room with his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally pausing to inspect the worn carpet or the set of books on the nearby shelf. "Tell me, Inspector," Holmes began, his voice calm. "What was the cause of death?" Lestrade shifted nervously. "A broken neck, obviously. It seems like she fell down the stairs, though no one heard anything until the scream," Holmes interrupted. "A convenient detail, wouldn't you say? How utterly pedestrian. The fall would have been silent, had she indeed stumbled." Watson frowned, following his friend's line of thought. "You don't believe this was an accident?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not for a moment, Watson. The widow has too many secrets. There's something at play here, and it's not merely a case of a fall." He turned to the staircase, his gaze fixed on a faint scuff mark on the polished wood. "A person doesn't fall here without a struggle." Holmes bent down, inspecting the mark more closely. Someone was in a hurry. Or perhaps someone did this on purpose. The widow's maid, a young woman named Clara, had discovered the body. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she recounted the events of the night. "I heard the scream, but when I rushed in, she was already gone." Holmes listened intently. "Tell me, Clara, did you notice anyone leaving the house that evening? Any visitors, perhaps?" The maid hesitated. "A gentleman arrived shortly before midnight, sir. He was rather well-dressed, though I didn't recognize him. He asked for the widow. I didn't know who he was, but he seemed quite upset when he left." "Interesting," Holmes murmured, his mind working quickly. "Describe him, if you please." Clara offered a vague description, mentioning dark hair, a tall figure, and a rather stern demeanor. He was wearing a long coat and had an air of urgency about him. "How convenient," Holmes muttered under his breath. He turned back to Lestrade. "We have our first suspect, a man with an urgent purpose." Holmes, never one to miss the smallest detail, began to examine Mrs. Grayson's personal effects. On a small writing desk near a family portrait, he found a letter. It was half hidden, as though someone had intended for it to remain unnoticed. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The words were terse, almost cryptic, speaking of an impending betrayal. The widow had obviously been troubled by something. "What do you make of this, Watson?" Holmes asked, showing his companion the letter. "Does it not strike you as odd that she had kept such an intimate document hidden?" Watson furrowed his brow. "It seems to hint at some dark secret. Could it be that someone in her life knew too much?" "Exactly," Holmes replied. "And someone was willing to ensure that secret would never see the light of day." As Holmes pondered the contents of the letter, a sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lestrade, looking even more flustered than before. "A second crime, Mr. Holmes. We've found a body in the same part of town." "Another woman, also connected to Mrs. Grayson." Holmes stood up abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "The game is afoot, Watson. Let us see what this new development has to offer." The cold morning air bit sharply as Holmes and Watson arrived at the scene of the second crime. The street seemed even more oppressive than the night before, as though the city itself was suffocating under the weight of the mysteries unfolding within it. Lestrade met them outside a small, dimly lit alleyway just off the main road. His usual bluster was absent, replaced by a look of grim resignation. "Another one, Holmes," Lestrade said quietly, his voice betraying his frustration. "Just like Mrs. Grayson. A woman found dead in a similar position. It's as though we're caught in a twisted pattern." Holmes surveyed the scene with an intensity that seemed to strip the fog of its mystery. The body, that of a middle-aged woman, lay face down in the alley, her hands clenched as if trying to protect herself from an unseen force. The air was thick with the unmistakable scent of fear. But there was something more. Something hidden beneath the surface. Holmes crouched beside the body, carefully inspecting the details. The victim's clothing was plain but neat, a simple dress with a few stains that suggested a hurried escape, and her shoes had dirt on them, as though she had walked through a garden or a patch of muddy earth. Just like Mrs. Grayson, she was wearing shoes that seemed out of place. Holmes murmured almost to himself. "And look here." He pointed to the woman's hand, where a small scrap of torn paper clung to her fingers. Lestrade reached in, pulling it free with a small, careful gesture. The paper was stained and slightly crumpled, but the words were legible. "The truth lies hidden beneath the floorboards." A peculiar statement, one that was both unsettling and telling. It seemed to link this death to the widow's. But how? "Do you see the connection, Watson?" Holmes asked, his gaze flickering over the alley's shadows, searching for something more. Watson frowned as he studied the paper. "It's the same handwriting as the letter you found in Mrs. Grayson's study. Whoever wrote this must be involved in both deaths. Holmes nodded, the wheels of his mind already turning. "Indeed. This is no mere coincidence. But the question remains, what was the truth these women knew? And who would go to such lengths to silence them?" He rose to his feet, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Lestrade, I trust you have already secured the area." Lestrade nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. No one has come in or out since we found the body. We've notified the other officers to stand guard. But you still don't understand the significance of the clue," Holmes interrupted, his voice cold and detached. He turned away from the body, his gaze sweeping the alleyway, as though the very walls were hiding their secrets. "I can tell by your reaction that this woman did not die by accident. But let us not rush to conclusions," Holmes said thoughtfully, his mind already 2 steps ahead. "What we must determine now is the link between this woman and the widow. It is no longer a simple case of 2 deaths. It is a tangled web, one that will not be untangled easily." Watson, always eager to follow Holmes's reasoning, pressed him further. "So, you think this is a deliberate pattern? That the women were targeted for something they knew?" Holmes paused, his gaze sharp as he turned back toward Watson. "Not just something they knew, Watson. Something they were about to reveal." As the hours passed, Holmes's mind seemed to race ahead of every clue. The connection between the 2 women was becoming clearer with each passing moment. But still, the core of the mystery remained obscured, like a distant shape lurking just beyond the fog. Lestrade, growing more agitated, began to show signs of impatience. "Holmes, we've done everything you asked. We've questioned the neighbors, we've examined the house, and yet nothing. What are we missing? There's something we're overlooking, I know it. Holmes's gaze flickered toward Lestrade. It's not about what we are overlooking, Inspector. It's about what these women knew. They were both on the verge of revealing something, a secret too dangerous to be allowed to surface. But what? Watson asked, his voice low and urgent. What was so important that it led to their deaths? Holmes walked to the edge of the alley, staring into the misty distance, as though the answer was there hidden beneath the fog. That, Watson, is the key to unlocking this mystery. We must find the source of the secret they were about to reveal. Late that evening, Holmes returned to the widow's house, determined to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Inside, it was as if time had stopped. The only sound, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath Holmes's boots. He returned to Mrs. Grayson's study, his eyes scanning the room for something he might have missed. It was as though the walls themselves were whispering secrets, the very air thick with tension. Then, as he approached the bookshelf where he had first discovered the letter, something caught his eye. A small section of the floor beneath the shelf seemed to have been disturbed, as though someone had recently moved the wood. His fingers brushed the area, and a slight movement revealed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. With a swift motion, Holmes pried open the compartment, revealing a small box. Inside was a stack of documents, neatly folded and sealed with a wax stamp. Holmes' eyes gleamed with triumph. "This, Watson, is the key," he said softly. "The truth behind the widow's secret." As Holmes carefully examined the documents, Watson stood silently beside him, waiting. The contents of the box were not what either of them had expected. They were far more damning and far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The documents detailed a vast conspiracy, one that had been buried beneath layers of wealth and power, its roots reaching deep into the heart of London's elite. The widow and the woman in the alley had both been caught in the web of deceit, and they had been silenced for it. Holmes sat back, his fingers curling around the papers. "It seems, Watson, that this is only the beginning of a far greater mystery." Holmes held the papers in his hands with an almost reverential precision, the faintest glint of triumph in his eyes. Watson watched him, sensing that the tide of the investigation had finally turned. The box, hidden beneath the floorboards of Mrs. Grayson's study, had revealed more than just simple evidence. It had exposed a labyrinth of deceit, the kind of conspiracy that made even the most seasoned of detectives wary. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked quietly, though he had already guessed from the intensity in his friend's expression that they were standing at the threshold of something far greater than they had originally imagined. Holmes did not immediately respond, his fingers tracing the wax seal of the documents as if trying to decipher their very essence. He was silent for a moment, then looked up sharply. "This, Watson, is the crux of the matter, the truth about Mrs. Grayson's death and indeed the other woman's. It's not just about personal vengeance. It's far more insidious than that." Watson stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Holmes unfolded the first page of the documents with deliberate care, his sharp eyes scanning the text. "These documents, Watson, are a record of transactions, dealings that were hidden from the public eye. Deals that have the power to ruin some of the most influential families in this city." Watson's brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting blackmail?" "Not blackmail," Holmes replied, his tone darkening. "A far more calculated game. These papers outline the financial backings of a covert operation, an operation designed to manipulate political power and trade routes within the empire. Mrs. Grayson was more than just a widow. She was involved in something much bigger, something far more dangerous." Watson took a step back, processing the weight of Holmes's words. "But why would someone want her dead? And what about the other woman? How does she fit into all this?" Holmes paused, looking at the papers once more. "The other woman," he muttered, as if the words themselves carried a hidden meaning, "was a warning. Someone knew that Mrs. Grayson was on the verge of revealing the truth. She wasn't just a casualty of a political scheme, she was the linchpin." Watson stood frozen for a moment, trying to absorb the gravity of the situation. "You think the two deaths are connected by this conspiracy?" "Absolutely," Holmes said with certainty. "Both women had knowledge of the same secret, The first victim, Mrs. Grayson, was perhaps the most vulnerable. She had the most to lose. And the second, she was the one sent to retrieve what Mrs. Grayson had kept hidden, likely unaware of how dangerous that knowledge truly was. A sense of dread settled over Watson. He could feel the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on them. "But how do you know all of this, Holmes? How can you be certain?" Holmes placed the papers back into the box, carefully sealing it once more. "Because, Watson, the people behind this plot are too powerful to leave such matters to chance. They would never allow someone like Mrs. Grayson, with her connections and knowledge, to expose them. Her death was no accident. It was a carefully executed plan. But what they failed to anticipate was that someone else would come along, someone who could see through the fog of their machinations." He paused, looking at Watson with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. "That, Watson, is where we come in." The weight of Holmes' words hung in the air, and for a moment Watson could do nothing but nod, recognizing the inevitability of the path ahead. This was no longer a mere case. It was a battle against shadows, against unseen forces that operated in the darkest corners of society. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Holmes, ever the methodical investigator, pored over the details of the conspiracy with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every scrap of information was analyzed, every lead followed, though none of it made the picture any clearer. He and Watson visited every person who had been in contact with Mrs. Grayson, each interview building layer upon layer of suspicion, but none of it seemed to lead directly to the heart of the conspiracy. Then, on the fifth day, a breakthrough came when Holmes was contacted by one of his informants, a lowly clerk who worked for a merchants' guild. The message was brief but urgent. "Holmes, I've found something. Meet me at the docks near the old warehouse. Come alone." Holmes wasted no time in making arrangements. His usual manner of business was to leave Watson behind when the nature of the task was too delicate or dangerous, and this was no exception. The docks were as dreary and oppressive as ever. The fog had rolled in thick, and the air smelled of salt water and industrial waste. Holmes arrived alone, his footsteps muffled by the wet cobblestones as he made his way toward the warehouse, a crumbling, neglected structure that seemed more a relic of the past than a building of any importance. His informant, a slight man with a nervous manner, was already waiting in the shadows. He looked over his shoulder constantly, as though he feared he might be followed, and his eyes darted nervously toward Holmes. "I don't have much time, Mr. Holmes," the man whispered, "but I think I've found something you'll want to see." Holmes stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. "What have you found?" The informant handed him a small leather-bound ledger, worn from years of handling. "I found it in the office of one of the guild members. It's a list of transactions. More than just trade. I've seen names on here. Names that match those from the documents you found in Mrs. Grayson's house." Holmes took the ledger, his fingers lightly brushing over the surface as he flipped through the pages. As the contents of the ledger became clearer, his expression hardened. "This is it," Holmes said, his voice cold with realization. "The final link. These men, whoever they are playing a far more dangerous game than we thought." He looked up at his informant. "You've done well. But I fear that your involvement in this will not be without consequences." The informant swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? What do you intend to do?" Holmes's gaze remained steady, unyielding. "I intend to expose them. But the danger is far from over. Now we must prepare for the inevitable confrontation." As Holmes turned and began to walk away, his mind already working through the next steps, the full scale of the conspiracy began to take shape. The pieces were falling into place. The game was no longer about solving the mystery of two deaths. It was about uncovering a vast and intricate plot that could shake the very foundations of the city itself. And with each step, Holmes knew the stakes were only going to rise higher. Holmes returned to Baker Street with the ledger in hand, his mind already processing the information it contained. The faintest flicker of recognition passed through his eyes as he flipped through the pages, each transaction revealing further entanglements in the dark web of deceit that had already claimed two lives. The names were becoming more familiar, the connections tighter, and the weight of the conspiracy heavier with each passing moment. Watson, who had been reviewing notes from their previous investigations, looked up as Holmes entered. "What have you found, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He set the ledger down on the table, his fingers running over the worn cover, tracing the delicate stitching as if considering a puzzle. "What we are dealing with here, Watson, is not just a conspiracy to silence two women. It is a network of power players who have been operating under the radar for far too long." Watson moved closer, his curiosity piqued. "And the ledger, is it our smoking gun?" Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "In a way, yes. It links the deaths to a series of financial transactions that involve some of the most influential people in London. Men who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. These names, these dealings, they are the threads that connect our victims, and they lead directly to the heart of this network." He picked up the ledger and opened it to a page near the end. "Look here," he said, pointing to a particular name. "This individual, Lord Montclair, a prominent member of Parliament, is listed alongside several trade deals with known criminals, the very same criminals who were involved in Mrs. Grayson's hidden dealings." Watson leaned over to inspect the entry. "Montclair, I know him. He's been making waves in politics for years, but I thought his reputation was impeccable." "Reputation, Watson, is often a carefully constructed facade," Holmes replied, his voice tinged with quiet disdain. "Montclair's dealings in Parliament are mere distractions. The truth lies beneath, in the darker corridors where power and money flow unchecked." A sense of unease began to settle in the room, the gravity of the situation fully dawning on Watson. "So you think Montclair is directly involved in these deaths?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "Not just involved, Watson. He is the central figure in this elaborate scheme. Mrs. Grayson knew too much, and when she began to dig into matters that could destroy the foundation of their operations, she became expendable." "But why the other woman? Why kill her too?" Holmes paused, his eyes scanning the room as though considering the question from every angle. "The second woman," he said slowly, "was sent to retrieve what Mrs. Grayson had hidden. She too was a victim of circumstance, a pawn caught in a game she did not fully understand." Watson shook his head. "But if Montclair is at the center of this, why hasn't Scotland Yard made the connection? Why hasn't he been arrested?" "Because they are all in it together," Holmes replied, his voice sharp. "Montclair's influence stretches far beyond his political position. He has allies in the highest echelons of society, people who have ensured that no investigation will ever touch him. But now, Watson, we know the truth, and it is only a matter of time before it all unravels." Holmes turned away from Watson, moving toward the window, his gaze distant, lost in thought. The faintest glimmer of rain began to fall, the droplets tracing lines down the glass as the city outside seemed to fade into the mist. "It will not be easy," Holmes said quietly. "These people will fight to protect themselves. They will not allow their secrets to be exposed without a struggle, but they have underestimated us." Watson stood, his hands pressed together, his mind racing to keep pace with Holmes' rapid conclusions. "So what's our next move? We can't just confront Montclair directly, can we?" Holmes's lips curled into that same faint smile. "No. Watson, we must be far more strategic. If we are to expose him and those who back him, we must first learn everything we can about his network. We need to find his weaknesses, and we need to do so without alerting him to our intentions." The detective turned back to Watson, his gaze now focused and calculating. "I need you to gather information, Watson. Visit the people who know him best, his colleagues, his associates, anyone who might have knowledge of his private dealings. We must work in the shadows, for if we make the wrong move, Montclair will have us silenced before we can even gather enough evidence." Watson nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. "I'll get to work immediately, but what about you? What will you be doing?" Holmes hesitated for a moment before answering. "I will pay a visit to some of Montclair's less public acquaintances. There are always loose ends, Watson. People with motives, people who fear the truth coming to light. They will lead us to him, if we can find the right leverage." With that, Holmes gave Watson a final, penetrating look, as if the weight of the investigation had just increased tenfold. "The pieces are falling into place, but we must tread carefully. We are now in a race against time, and the longer we delay, the more danger we place ourselves in." As Holmes gathered his coat and hat, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation was about to take a turn for the worse. The closer they got to the truth, the more perilous the road ahead would become. The conspiracy that had claimed 2 innocent lives was much deeper than either of them had imagined, and now they had become part of it. Watson's day was spent in quiet observation, moving through the fog-drenched streets of London, seeking out the contacts that might know Lord Montclair's hidden side. Each conversation, each subtle inquiry, brought new pieces to the puzzle. But none of it seemed to lead directly to the man himself. Holmes, on the other hand, worked in the shadows, his mind always 10 steps ahead, using his network of informants and allies to track down Montclair's hidden dealings. With each new discovery, the walls seemed to close in on the politician, yet the final damning evidence remained elusive. As night fell, Holmes returned to Baker Street, the frustration evident in the tightness of his shoulders, the sharpness of his movements. "We are close, Watson," he said, his voice taut. "But they are moving against us. It will not be long before we are forced into a corner." The game was on. The following days passed in a blur of activity, each one blending into the next as Holmes and Watson grew ever closer to the heart of the mystery. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, yet something about the whole affair felt off, like a thread that had yet to be pulled. Holmes, normally so composed, was more restless than ever, his sharp mind darting from one lead to the next without pause. Watson, too, could sense the mounting tension. He'd followed his own investigations, gathering as much information as he could about Lord Montclair and his associates. The whispers of corruption, the veiled hints of shady dealings, it all pointed toward one undeniable conclusion. Montclair was a man who had more to lose than most, but what Watson couldn't yet determine was the nature of the secret Montclair was protecting. The ledger had revealed only the faintest outline of a grand scheme, but the details remained frustratingly elusive. Every lead he followed only seemed to lead to more questions, and the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Montclair's network was vast, its tendrils spreading into every corner of London's political and business world. Holmes, meanwhile, had taken to walking the streets alone, his sharp gaze scanning the faces of passers-by, as if searching for an unseen clue. His mind was working at full speed, and every conversation, every encounter, was an opportunity to gather more pieces for his mental tapestry. But there was something more pressing on his thoughts, something that lingered in the back of his mind like a persistent itch. One evening, as Watson sat at his desk, reviewing the latest batch of information, Holmes returned to Baker Street with a singular purpose in his stride. His eyes were bright, his expression set. "We found him, Watson," Holmes declared, his voice steady but tinged with a rare intensity. "Montclair is not just the puppet master, he is the target." Watson looked up, confusion flickering in his gaze. "What do you mean?" "Surely he is the one pulling the strings. We have enough evidence to bring him down." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, we are missing something. We are so focused on Montclair's role in this conspiracy that we've overlooked one crucial detail. He's being manipulated himself." Watson blinked, the realization dawning slowly. "You're saying someone else is controlling him?" Holmes nodded, his face grim. "Exactly. Montclair is a key player in a larger game, one that he doesn't fully understand. He's involved with forces far beyond his control, and the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that he is a pawn in someone else's scheme." Watson stood up, his mind racing. But why would he allow himself to be manipulated like this? He's not a man easily controlled. Because, Watson, he's been drawn into something far more dangerous than he anticipated. Someone with more power, more influence, has coiled themselves around him like a serpent, and now they're using him to carry out their own agenda. Holmes paused, as though considering the weight of his own words. "We need to find out who is behind this, who is pulling the strings on Montclair. Once we know that, we'll have the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy." The urgency in Holmes's voice was unmistakable. Watson understood that time was running out. If Montclair truly was being manipulated, then whoever controlled him would go to even greater lengths to protect their interests. "How do we find them?" "Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice steady despite the tension mounting in the room. Holmes's eyes narrowed with a sharp intensity. "We must look at Montclair's closest circle. He trusts a few individuals implicitly, people he believes are loyal. We will start with them, but we must be subtle. If we make a single misstep, we risk tipping our hand, and Montclair's puppet masters will have us silenced before we can even strike." The next few days were spent in quiet observation. Holmes, Watson, and even Lestrade were drawn into a network of covert investigations, each one building toward the central figure who stood at the center of it all. Holmes kept a close watch on Montclair's movements, and Watson, as always, played the role of his trusted confidant. They learned that Montclair had been in contact with several influential figures, including a shadowy financier known only as Reinhardt. The name was familiar to Watson, a known figure in high society circles, but the details surrounding him were few and far between. He was a man of wealth, influence, and secrecy, a combination that in Holmes's eyes made him the perfect candidate for the puppet master Holmes had been searching for. Holmes's suspicion was confirmed when they managed to intercept a confidential letter sent from Montclair to Reinhardt. It was short, simple, and written in the most coded language imaginable. The letter contained instructions, promises of future rewards, and a veiled warning. "The game is nearing its end. Do not underestimate our enemy." The significance of the letter was clear. Montclair was indeed under the control of someone else, someone who had the power to shape events with terrifying precision. Reinhardt was the key to understanding the larger conspiracy, and Holmes knew that if they were to expose the full extent of the plot, they would need to confront him. "We have no choice but to confront Reinhardt directly," Holmes said, as they reviewed the letter in their study. "He is the last piece of the puzzle, and once we have him, the entire network will collapse." Watson nodded, though he could feel the tension in the air. "But how do we get to him, Holmes? He's no fool. He'll be expecting us to make a move." Holmes paused, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Then, Watson, we must make sure he never sees it coming." The final stage of their investigation had begun. The stakes had risen, and with every step they took, the danger grew more immediate. But Holmes, as always, was unflinching. The truth was within reach, and the following days passed in a haze of quiet strategy. Holmes had made it clear that their approach to Reinhardt had to be both calculated and subtle. Every move needed to be carefully crafted, for one mistake could cost them everything. But even in the silence of their waiting game, Holmes's mind never stopped whirring, pulling threads together, weaving a more intricate web with each passing hour. They had no direct lead to Reinhardt's location. He was a shadowy figure, always, elusive, never seen in public without a protective veil of secrecy. His wealth, influence, and connections kept him untouchable, but Holmes had always believed that no one was completely beyond reach. There was always a flaw, always a crack in the armor. It was during one of these long stretches of observation that Holmes received an unexpected visit from an old acquaintance, a man whose name had not crossed his mind for some time, yet who was precisely the type of person Holmes needed to track down a shadow like Reinhardt. The visitor, a former associate of Holmes's from his earlier days, was a man known for his ability to gather information through unconventional means. He was a fixer of sorts, operating in the underbelly of London's criminal world, and though his methods were often unorthodox, his results were indisputable. "Holmes," the man greeted, his face weathered and lined with age, but his eyes still sharp. "I heard you were looking for someone. I've got a few leads on that elusive financier of yours." Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. "Reinhardt," he said, his voice cold with focus. "I need to know everything about him. His connections, his business dealings, his habits, every scrap of information you can dig up." The man nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Of course. But be warned, Holmes. This one's not like the usual sorts. He's got friends in high places, people who would rather you didn't poke around too much." Holmes returned his gaze steadily. "Then I will be very careful. But I have no intention of backing down." Over the next several days, Holmes and Watson were drawn deeper into a world they had never expected to uncover. The information about Reinhardt began to trickle in, one fact at a time. He had no official residence, no permanent address, and his business dealings were deliberately convoluted, a web of shell companies and hidden partnerships. But there were patterns, subtle clues hidden in the labyrinth of his financial empire that Holmes was quick to identify. "Look at this, Watson," Holmes said one evening, as he sifted through the piles of notes and documents that had accumulated over the past few days. "Reinhardt isn't just hiding from us, he's hiding from someone else too. These transactions aren't just a series of business deals, they're a trail of debts, obligations, and promises. Someone is holding something over him, and it's not just money." Watson leaned over, studying the papers Holmes had laid out. "Do you think someone else is controlling him just as Montclair was controlled?" Holmes nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "Yes, Watson. Reinhardt is not the puppet master here. He's merely another player in a much larger game. But his role, it seems, is to act as a financier, a man with the means to fund operations and cover the tracks of the true power behind the scenes." The pieces were falling into place. But with each revelation, the sense of danger grew more palpable. Holmes was certain now that Reinhardt was just one cog in a much larger, far more sinister machine. But who was the mastermind pulling the strings? And why had they chosen Montclair and Mrs. Grayson as their pawns? The investigation had already cost them valuable time. Holmes knew it was only a matter of time before Reinhardt, or the forces behind him, caught wind of their efforts. They had to act swiftly. It was on a particularly damp afternoon that Holmes finally received the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The fixer had returned with news. He had managed to track down a key associate of Reinhardt's, someone who was privy to the financier's deepest secrets. This man, however, was not easily approached. He was a ghost in London's underground circles, someone who avoided the light of day and operated through intermediaries. Holmes was unfazed. "We will find him," he declared. "We always do." And so they began the delicate task of setting up a meeting. Through a network of informants and careful maneuvering, Holmes and Watson managed to get word to the man, arranging for a clandestine meeting in a remote part of London, one where no prying eyes would see. The day arrived with a grim sense of anticipation. Holmes, as ever, was calm and collected, his every step deliberate. Watson, less accustomed to the secrecy and tension of such dealings, felt a slight unease gnaw at him, but he trusted Holmes implicitly. They arrived at the location, an old warehouse on the edge of the city, where the meeting was to take place. The area was deserted, save for a few stray cats slinking through the shadows. Holmes motioned for Watson to remain silent as they approached the entrance, every step taken with careful precision. A few moments later, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, cloaked, and with a face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Holmes stopped at a safe distance, waiting for the figure to speak. The man's voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. "You're the detective, the famous Sherlock Holmes." Holmes did not flinch. "And you are the man who has been watching Reinhardt from the shadows. I trust you have information that will prove useful to my investigation." The man chuckled softly, a dark sound. "Useful? You're asking the wrong question, Holmes. The real question is, how far are you willing to go to get what you want? Because Reinhardt is not just another criminal. You're stepping into a war. You don't understand." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Then explain it to me." The man paused, his breath coming in short, heavy bursts. "You're asking about the mastermind. But what you really need to know is that there are lines you don't cross. And you, Holmes, are about to cross every single one of them." Holmes smiled faintly. "I was hoping for something more substantial." The man's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and resolve. "You'll get your answers, but know this. By the time you uncover the truth, it may already be too late." The figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Holmes and Watson standing in the dim light, the weight of his words hanging heavy between them. "Too late for what, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice low. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the darkness. "That," Holmes said softly, "is the question we must answer before it is truly too late." The cryptic warning lingered in the air long after the mysterious figure had vanished. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness where the man had disappeared, as though searching for the faintest trace of him. Watson, ever the more impatient of the two, shifted uneasily beside him, the silence stretching between them. "Holmes," Watson finally said, his voice tinged with frustration. "What was that all about? We were getting closer to Reinhardt, and now this man has thrown us off track with vague threats." Holmes turned slowly to face Watson, his gaze piercing. "It seems we are now more deeply entrenched in this conspiracy than I originally anticipated. Whoever is behind Reinhardt has not only managed to manipulate Montclair, but has also gone to great lengths to protect their identity. That man, whoever he is, knows more than he is letting on. Then why didn't he give us anything concrete?" Watson asked, exasperation evident in his tone. "Why tell us we're crossing lines we don't understand if he isn't going to explain?" Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little amusement in it. "Because, Watson, the stakes are rising. This is no longer about just uncovering a web of corruption. We've entered a far more dangerous game. The warning is precisely what I expected. Whoever is orchestrating this has become aware of our investigation." The detective paused, his mind whirring through possible avenues, his sharp intellect already piecing together the few scraps of information they had gathered. This isn't a simple conspiracy of a few men hoping to gain power. It is far more systematic, a network of influence, money, and secrecy that stretches beyond even my expectations. Watson looked at Holmes, sensing the shift in his friend's demeanor. Holmes had always been confident, but now there was a certain edge to him, a deepening awareness that this case was more perilous than either of them had realized. "Then what do we do now?" Watson asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Holmes's expression darkened. "We continue, of course. There is no turning back now, but we must be more cautious, more deliberate. I need to find where Reinhardt is hiding, and to do that we need to approach his allies, his business associates. If we can find where the money flows, we can trace it back to him." The next few days were spent tracking down leads that led them through London's labyrinth of back streets, smoky taverns, and clandestine meetings. Holmes was unfazed by the threats that seemed to hang over them with every step. For him, the truth was a flame that could not be extinguished, no matter how deep the darkness surrounding it grew. They learned that Reinhardt's network was far-reaching, with ties to several prominent individuals in the city's elite circles. But none of them seemed willing to speak openly about him, and every inquiry led to dead ends or cryptic answers. People were afraid of something far greater than simple legal repercussions. It wasn't until they visited one of Reinhardt's lesser-known business partners, a man named Edward Bellamy, that they uncovered a glimmer of hope. Bellamy, an unremarkable figure in the world of finance, had a reputation for being a silent partner in many operations, his name often appearing on business papers, but never in public discussions. Holmes suspected that Bellamy knew more than he let on, and so he set up a meeting with him under the guise of discussing potential investments. The meeting was held in a private office tucked away in one of London's quieter districts, a place that reeked of money and discretion. Bellamy, a short, balding man with a nervous demeanor, greeted them warily as they entered. He was no stranger to Holmes, though he certainly wasn't pleased to see him. "Mr. Holmes," Bellamy said, offering a stiff handshake. "I wasn't expecting a visit from someone of your reputation." Holmes studied Bellamy closely, his eyes scanning the man's features for any hint of discomfort. "I'm sure you weren't," he replied smoothly. "But you must understand, Mr. Bellamy, that I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm simply looking for information I believe you can provide." Bellamy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not used to being on the receiving end of such directness. "I don't know what you think I can tell you, Holmes," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just a businessman. I don't get involved in the kind of dealings you're suggesting." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Bellamy's. "I don't believe that's entirely true. You've been involved with Reinhardt for years, and now with the events surrounding Mrs. Grayson's death and Montclair's involvement, I suspect you know more than you're letting on. The question, here's what is it you're hiding?" Bellamy's face paled, and for the briefest moment, Holmes saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know anything about any conspiracy." "You're wrong, Holmes. I've kept my distance. My association with Reinhardt is purely financial. I don't know what he's been up to, and I have no interest in getting involved." Holmes studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. No interest, you say? Well, Mr. Bellamy, you might be more involved than you think. You see, the web you've woven is much thicker than you realize. If you continue to deny your involvement, I'll have no choice but to make this matter public. I'm sure the authorities would be very interested in hearing your side of the story. Bellamy shifted again, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, avoiding Holmes's gaze. I don't know where Reinhardt is, but I can tell you this. He's not the only one in this game. There are others, people who want things to remain hidden no matter the cost. Holmes leaned back, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to take form. Who are these people, Bellamy? Who are they protecting? Bellamy hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door. I can't say. I've said too much already. But they're dangerous, Holmes. More dangerous than you know. If you keep digging, you'll only put yourself in greater peril. Holmes stood abruptly, his expression cold but determined. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Bellamy. I trust that we won't need to speak again unless absolutely necessary. Watson, too, could sense the mounting tension. He'd followed his own investigations, gathering as much information as he could about Lord Montclair and his associates. The whispers of corruption, the veiled hints of shady dealings, it all pointed toward one undeniable conclusion. Montclair was a man who had more to lose than most, but what Watson couldn't yet determine was the nature of the secret Montclair was protecting. The ledger had revealed only the faintest outline of a grand scheme, but the details remained frustratingly elusive. Every lead he followed only seemed to lead to more questions, and the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Montclair's network was vast, its tendrils spreading into every corner of London's political and business world. Holmes, meanwhile, had taken to walking the streets alone, his sharp gaze scanning the faces of passers-by as if searching for an unseen clue. His mind was working at full speed, and every conversation, every encounter, was an opportunity to gather more pieces for his mental tapestry. But there was something more pressing on his thoughts, something that lingered in the back of his mind like a persistent itch. One evening, as Watson sat at his desk, reviewing the latest batch of information, Holmes returned to Baker Street with a singular purpose in his stride. His eyes were bright, his expression set. "We found him, Watson," Holmes declared, his voice steady but tinged with a rare intensity. "Montclair is not just the puppet master, he is the target." Watson looked up, confusion flickering in his gaze. "What do you mean?" "Surely he is the one pulling the strings. We have enough evidence to bring him down." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, we are missing something. We are so focused on Montclair's role in this conspiracy that we've overlooked one crucial detail. He's being manipulated himself." Watson blinked, the realization dawning slowly. "You're saying someone else is controlling him?" Holmes nodded, his face grim. "Exactly. Montclair is a key player in a larger game, one that he doesn't fully understand. He's involved with forces far beyond his control, and the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that he is a pawn in someone else's scheme." Watson stood up, his mind racing. But why would he allow himself to be manipulated like this? He's not a man easily controlled. Because, Watson, he's been drawn into something far more dangerous than he anticipated. Someone with more power, more influence, has coiled themselves around him like a serpent, and now they're using him to carry out their own agenda. Holmes paused, as though considering the weight of his own words. "We need to find out who is behind this, who is pulling the strings on Montclair. Once we know that, we'll have the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy." The urgency in Holmes's voice was unmistakable. Watson understood that time was running out. If Montclair truly was being manipulated, then whoever controlled him would go to even greater lengths to protect their interests. "How do we find them?" "Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice steady despite the tension mounting in the room. Holmes's eyes narrowed with a sharp intensity. "We must look at Montclair's closest circle. He trusts a few individuals implicitly, people he believes are loyal. We will start with them, but we must be subtle. If we make a single misstep, we risk tipping our hand, and Montclair's puppet masters will have us silenced before we can even strike." The next few days were spent in quiet observation. Holmes, Watson, and even Lestrade were drawn into a network of covert investigations, each one building toward the central figure who stood at the center of it all. Holmes kept a close watch on Montclair's movements, and Watson, as always, played the role of his trusted confidant. They learned that Montclair had been in contact with several influential figures, including a shadowy financier known only as Reinhardt. The name was familiar to Watson, a known figure in high society circles, but the details surrounding him were few and far between. He was a man of wealth, influence, and secrecy, a combination that in Holmes's eyes made him the perfect candidate for the puppet master Holmes had been searching for. Holmes's suspicion was confirmed when they managed to intercept a confidential letter sent from Montclair to Reinhardt. It was short, simple, and written in the most coded language imaginable. The letter contained instructions, promises of future rewards, and a veiled warning. The game is nearing its end. Do not underestimate our enemy. The significance of the letter was clear. Montclair was indeed under the control of someone else, someone who had the power to shape events with terrifying precision. Reinhardt was the key to understanding the larger conspiracy, and Holmes knew that if they were to expose the full extent of the plot, they would need to confront him. "We have no choice but to confront Reinhardt directly," Holmes said, as they reviewed the letter in their study. "He is the last piece of the puzzle, and once we have him, the entire network will collapse." Watson nodded, though he could feel the tension in the air. "But how do we get to him, Holmes? He's no fool. He'll be expecting us to make a move." Holmes paused, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Then, Watson, we must make sure he never sees it coming." The final stage of their investigation had begun. The stakes had risen, and with every step they took, the danger grew more immediate. But Holmes, as always, was unflinching. The truth was within reach, and the following days passed in a haze of quiet strategy. Holmes had made it clear that their approach to Reinhardt had to be both calculated and subtle. Every move needed to be carefully crafted, for one mistake could cost them everything. But even in the silence of their waiting game, Holmes's mind never stopped whirring, pulling threads together, weaving a more intricate web with each passing hour. They had no direct lead to Reinhardt's location. He was a shadowy figure, always elusive, never seen in public without a protective veil of secrecy. His wealth, influence, and connections kept him untouchable, but Holmes had always believed that no one was completely beyond reach. There was always a flaw, always a crack in the armor. It was during one of these long stretches of observation that Holmes received an unexpected visit from an old acquaintance, a man whose name had not crossed his mind for some time, yet who was precisely the type of person Holmes needed to track down a shadow like Reinhardt. The visitor, a former associate of Holmes's from his earlier days, was a man known for his ability to gather information through unconventional means. He was a fixer of sorts, operating in the underbelly of London's criminal world, and though his methods were often unorthodox, his results were indisputable. "Holmes," the man greeted, his face weathered and lined with age, but his eyes still sharp. "I heard you were looking for someone. I've got a few leads on that elusive financier of yours." Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. "Reinhardt," he said, his voice cold with focus. "I need to know everything about him. His connections, his business dealings, his habits, every scrap of information you can dig up." The man nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Of course. But be warned, Holmes. This one's not like the usual sorts. He's got friends in high places, people who would rather you didn't poke around too much." Holmes returned his gaze steadily. "Then I will be very careful. But I have no intention of backing down." Over the next several days, Holmes and Watson were drawn deeper into a world they had never expected to uncover. The information about Reinhardt began to trickle in, one fact at a time. He had no official residence, no permanent address, and his business dealings were deliberately convoluted, a web of shell companies and hidden partnerships. But there were patterns, subtle clues hidden in the labyrinth of his financial empire that Holmes was quick to identify. "Look at this, Watson," Holmes said one evening, as he sifted through the piles of notes and documents that had accumulated over the past few days. "Reinhardt isn't just hiding from us, he's hiding from someone else too. These transactions aren't just a series of business deals, they're a trail of debts, obligations, and promises. Someone is holding something over him, and it's not just money. Watson leaned over, studying the papers Holmes had laid out. Do you think someone else is controlling him just as Montclair was controlled? Holmes nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. Yes, Watson. Reinhardt is not the puppet master here. He's merely another player in a much larger game. But his role, it seems, is to act as a financier, a man with the means to fund operations and cover the tracks of the true power behind the scenes. The pieces were falling into place. But with each revelation, the sense of danger grew more palpable. Holmes was certain now that Reinhardt was just one cog in a much larger, far more sinister machine. But who was the mastermind pulling the strings? And why had they chosen Montclair and Mrs. Grayson as their pawns? The investigation had already cost them valuable time. Holmes knew it was only a matter of time before Reinhardt, or the forces behind him, caught wind of their efforts. They had to act swiftly. Minutes passed like hours, each one stretching longer than the last. Holmes remained unmoving, his eyes scanning the horizon, as though he could will the ship into view with nothing but his concentration. Finally, a shadow appeared on the water, a ship's silhouette emerging from the fog, its lights dim and distant. It was not large, but it was enough to carry the illicit cargo Holmes had been tracking for so long. Here it comes, Holmes said, his voice low and steady. Prepare yourself. Watson, stay close and remember, the goal is not to confront them directly unless we must. Watson nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his side. Though he knew Holmes had planned every detail of the operation, there was always the possibility of unforeseen complications. They had been close before, but this time felt different. The danger was more immediate, more real. This was the final confrontation. As the ship neared the dock, Holmes moved with practiced ease, signaling to the small group of operatives he had stationed nearby. They had carefully positioned themselves in strategic points, ready to move in the moment the ship came to a stop. Watson followed Holmes, the weight of the revolver a heavy reminder of the risk they were about to face. The ship glided to a halt alongside the dock with little sound, its crew seemingly unaware of the trap waiting for them. Holmes stepped forward, his hand outstretched to signal for the operatives to advance. But just as they were about to make their move, a sudden noise from behind stopped them. Footsteps, hurried and heavy, approaching rapidly. "Holmes!" Watson hissed, his eyes wide with alarm. "We've been spotted!" Holmes spun around, his hand quickly reaching for the concealed weapon at his belt. The figure emerging from the shadows was unmistakable, Reinhardt himself, stepping from the darkness with an air of confident assurance. Behind him were two men armed and ready, their eyes scanning the dock with suspicion. "I had a feeling you would be here," Reinhardt said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. He stepped forward, with a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze flicking from Holmes to Watson with a cold, calculating look. "You've done well, Holmes, to track me this far, but I think you've underestimated what's at stake." Holmes did not flinch. "You've underestimated me, Reinhardt. This ends tonight, your network, your conspiracy. Everything you've built is about to be exposed." Reinhardt chuckled, the sound dark and amused. "You think so? You're too late. You've walked into a game far bigger than you can comprehend. You think this shipment is the key to it all? It's only a small part of a much larger operation, one that you've been stumbling around in for weeks without realizing the full picture." Watson's grip tightened on his revolver, but Holmes held up a hand, signaling for him to stay calm. The words Reinhardt spoke only confirmed what Holmes had suspected. There was more at play here, something far more intricate than the surface of the investigation had suggested. But Reinhardt's arrogance was his greatest mistake. "I've already seen enough, Reinhardt," Holmes said, his voice steady but firm. "Your web is unraveling, and there's nowhere left to hide. You can't run from the truth any longer, say. Men behind Reinhardt tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons. But Reinhardt raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. "You may have found a few answers, Holmes," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But the truth you're looking for is far more dangerous than you realize. You've only scratched the surface, and now you'll regret digging any deeper." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I've come too far to turn back now. You're finished?" Reinhardt's smile faltered, but it was replaced with a cold, calculating look. "Perhaps he said quietly. "But you're about to learn just how costly your pursuit of the truth can be." In that moment, as the tension between them reached its peak, Holmes knew that the final confrontation had arrived. What happened next would determine everything. Holmes held Reinhardt's gaze, his eyes unwavering as the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Every instinct told him that this was the moment of truth. Reinhardt, though calm on the surface, was not as composed as he seemed. His grip on his composure was slipping, and Holmes could feel the pressure building. Reinhardt had underestimated the power of Holmes's determination, and that would be his downfall. Without warning, Reinhardt's expression changed. The cold smile melted away, replaced by something darker, more calculating. "You're not just a meddling detective, are you, Holmes?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're a threat, a real one that can't be allowed to keep poking around." Holmes didn't flinch. "I've already poked around, Reinhardt, and I found enough to expose you. It's over." Reinhardt's hand dropped to his side, where a weapon was concealed, but before he could make a move, Holmes's operatives surged forward from the shadows, surrounding Reinhardt and his men in an instant. The two armed men hesitated, their eyes darting between Reinhardt and the detectives. But they were too slow. Holmes's team had anticipated the move, and within seconds, Reinhardt and his associates were disarmed, their weapons taken from them, without a shot being fired. Reinhardt's eyes blazed with fury, but there was an undercurrent of panic in his movements. He was losing control, and he knew it. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze piercing as he addressed the man who had eluded justice for so long. "You've run this operation for too long," Holmes said. "You thought you could control everyone, pull the strings from the shadows. But you were wrong. We've found you, Reinhardt. The game is over." Reinhardt's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Instead, he glanced quickly at his men, and for a split second, Holmes thought he might attempt to make a run for it. But then Reinhardt sighed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of defeat pressed down on him. His eyes met Holmes with an expression that was almost resigned. "You think you've won," Reinhardt said, his voice thick with bitterness. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just about money or power. This is bigger than you can imagine." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Reinhardt. I've pieced together enough to understand the scope of your operation. The financial networks, the hidden deals, the manipulation of politics and power, all of it. But it's all coming to light now." Reinhardt's face twisted into a bitter sneer. "You have no idea how far this goes. You think you've unraveled the mystery, but you've barely scratched the surface. The truth you think you've found? It's just the beginning. You're about to discover how deep the rot really runs." Holmes paused for a moment, considering Reinhardt's words. He had suspected that this was more than just a conspiracy to profit or gain political control. There were forces at work here. That transcended what he had originally understood. But there was no time to dwell on the implications. The facts were clear now. Reinhardt and his network were responsible for the deaths of Mrs. Grayson and the others, and the conspiracy had reached the highest levels of power. The question now was how far it reached and how much damage had already been done. "You're wrong, Reinhardt," Holmes said, his voice unwavering. "You'll have your day in court, and when the truth is revealed, your network will crumble. But for now it ends with you." Reinhardt's expression darkened as he was handcuffed by one of Holmes's operatives. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you've stopped me? You're just a pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand. You'll never know the full picture, Holmes. You'll never know who's really behind this." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "I've already found the pieces, Reinhardt. I don't need to know everything. Your involvement is enough to end this. The rest will come in time." As Reinhardt was led away, his defiance still clear in his eyes, Watson turned to Holmes, his brow furrowed in concern. "Do you really believe it's over, Holmes? He's right about one thing. We've only scratched the surface. We don't know the full extent of what's been going on." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure of Reinhardt. "He's right, Watson. There's more to this than we've uncovered, but we have the key players, and that's where we begin. Reinhardt may have been the one pulling the strings, but we've now identified the source of the power he was wielding. Whoever is behind this will soon know that their game is up." Watson looked skeptical, but he trusted Holmes's judgment. So, what now? Holmes turned to face him, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. Now we follow the remaining threads. We've already uncovered a financial trail that leads us to the higher levels of this operation. There are people who think they can hide in the shadows, but their secrets are starting to surface. And once we identify the full extent of this conspiracy, the truth will be exposed. In the days that followed, Holmes and Watson worked tirelessly to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. They analyzed the financial documents Reinhardt had left behind, uncovered more connections between the powerful figures involved, and began to piece together the larger conspiracy that had ensnared so many. Holmes knew that the battle was far from over. Reinhardt's arrest was just the beginning. The deeper they dug, the more they discovered, and soon it became clear that the true mastermind was still out there, pulling the strings from the shadows. But Holmes was undeterred. He had already won the most important victory. He had uncovered the truth, and now it was only a matter of time before the rest of the conspiracy unraveled. As they moved closer to the final revelation, Holmes felt a quiet satisfaction. The game was far from over, but with every step they were getting closer to the heart of the mystery. The stakes were high and the danger was real, but for Holmes, it was all part of the challenge. Now the pieces of the puzzle were in place. Holmes and Watson had traced the conspiracy to its very roots, uncovering a network so vast that it had seemed nearly impossible to untangle. Reinhardt was in custody, his connections to the powerful figures of London exposed. Yet, as Holmes had suspected, there was more, always more. The culmination of their investigation had led them to a single undeniable truth. The conspiracy was not just about power, money, or politics. It was about control over the very fabric of society, and the mastermind behind it all had been operating from the shadows for years, manipulating events with an unseen hand, their true identity carefully concealed. Holmes stood before a large desk in the quiet confines of his study, his gaze fixed on a final stack of documents that lay before him. He had spent the last few days reviewing every scrap of evidence, every clue that had been uncovered. The truth was now undeniable, and it was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. "Holmes," Watson said, stepping into the room, his voice cautious. "You've been quiet. We've got Reinhardt, but I can see there's still something on your mind. What haven't we uncovered?" Holmes glanced up from the documents, his expression serious. "The true architect of this conspiracy is not Reinhardt. He was merely a tool, a means to an end. The person behind this operation has been manipulating everything from the shadows. But the connections, they point to someone we never expected." Watson raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Holmes stood and paced the room, the weight of the realization heavy on his shoulders. "The connections lead to the very heart of power in this city. The person pulling the strings, the mastermind, is none other than Lord Montclair." Watson's eyes widened in shock. "Montclair? But he's been at the center of the political scene for years. How could we have missed him?" Holmes stopped pacing, his gaze piercing. "Montclair has been playing both sides, Watson. He positioned himself as a man of influence, but his true allegiance has always been with the network. He used Reinhardt as his puppet, and in turn, Reinhardt manipulated the rest. Montclair orchestrated the entire operation, manipulating laws, making deals in the shadows, pulling strings behind closed doors." Watson took a step forward, his mind racing to catch up. But why would Montclair do this? He has everything: wealth, power, respect. Why risk it all for this? Holmes's expression grew even more serious. Because Montclair didn't just want power, he wanted total control. He believed that the system could be bent to his will, that the laws of the land could be manipulated to serve him. He was using the conspiracy to shape the future of London, to eliminate anyone who stood in his way, and build a future where he held the reins. Holmes walked to the window, staring out over the city with a quiet intensity. And he almost succeeded. Watson, almost. The final confrontation was inevitable. Holmes knew that Montclair would not allow himself to be caught without a fight. The mastermind had spent years weaving his web, and now that it was unraveling, he would do anything to protect himself. But Holmes, always several steps ahead, had already prepared for this moment. The operatives he had placed around Montclair's inner circle had reported back with enough evidence to bring him to trial, if they could catch him. It didn't take long for the final pieces to fall into place. A meeting was scheduled at one of Montclair's private estates, a secluded property that was heavily guarded. But Holmes, with his usual brilliance, had anticipated Montclair's next move and orchestrated a plan to expose him for good. As the operatives closed in on Montclair, Holmes and Watson took their positions, prepared for the final showdown. Montclair, standing tall in his study, was not the picture of fear. Instead, he was calm, almost resigned. He knew the game was ending, but he would not go quietly. "You've done well, Holmes," Montclair said, his voice cold, yet tinged with admiration. "But it's too late now. You've uncovered the conspiracy. But do you truly believe you can stop what's already in motion?" Holmes stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "Your time is up, Montclair. The network you've built will be torn apart piece by piece, and soon the truth will be known to everyone." Montclair sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've won? I've been preparing for this day for years. You have no idea how deep the roots go." Holmes met his gaze, his voice steady. "It's over, Montclair. Your influence, your power, it's all been exposed. The truth will come to light, and there's no running from it now." For a long moment, Montclair seemed to consider his options, but in the end he made no move to resist as the operatives advanced. He knew the game was over. The investigation had unraveled his entire operation, and now there was no escape. Months later, after Montclair's arrest and the subsequent unraveling of his network, Holmes and Watson stood once again in Baker Street, reflecting on the case that had consumed their lives for so long. "You were right, Holmes," Watson said, looking over the case files. "It's incredible how deep the conspiracy ran. Montclair wasn't just a man of politics. He was a puppet master, controlling everything from the shadows." Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. "It's always the ones who think they can control everything who are the most dangerous, Watson. They forget that the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how carefully it's buried." Watson smiled, albeit slightly wearily. "And you, as always, have been the one to uncover it." Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "There's always more to uncover, Watson. The world is full of secrets, some of them darker than others. But as long as there are mysteries, we'll continue solving them." As they sat back in their familiar chairs, the weight of the case behind them, Holmes couldn't help but feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that once again, justice had been served. But there was always another case on the horizon, and for Holmes, the pursuit of truth was a journey that never truly ended.